The wind that day smelled of dust and dry sage, and it carried, faintly, the tang of rusted iron from the old stamp mill on the ridge. The same smell, she would later realize, that had clung to her father's coat pockets for 30 years. She had $11, a dead father's deed to a town nobody wanted, and a dog who would not stop staring at the floor of an empty chapel. That was all Mercy Calloway owned in the autumn of 1887, and the men of Prescott Hollow found it hilarious. They said she'd inherited a pile of splinters, and a debt she couldn't pay, and that only a fool would ride 2 days into the high country to save a place already given up for dead. She paid it anyway, every last coin, counted out on the county clerk's desk with her chin lifted, so no one would see her hands shake. Behind her, pressed against her boot heel, sat a copper-colored cattle dog named Scout, ears pricked at something none of the men in that office could hear. Nobody in Prescott Hollow believed Ironwood Gulch held anything but dust and old regret. They didn't know what the dog knew. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mercy Calloway and her faithful dog, Scout. If you've ever been laughed at for holding on to something everyone else had thrown away, or you've ever found treasure hiding inside the mundane, tell us in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you found yours. We should start further back, because a woman doesn't arrive at a county clerk's desk with her last $11 without a long road behind her, and Mercy's road had been long indeed. She was 31 years old that autumn, unmarried by choice as much as circumstance, and she had spent the better part of the last decade nursing her father, Elias Calloway, through the slow unraveling that mining camp lungs bring to a man who has spent his life underground. Elias had been an assayer, a quiet, careful man who weighed other men's dreams in scales no bigger than his palm, who could look at a fistful of ore and tell you, within a few pennyweight, whether it would make a man rich or ruin him. He was known across 3 territories for his honesty, which in a business built on hope and desperation was a rarer commodity than the silver itself. People trusted Elias Calloway's numbers. Mine owners hated that about him, because his numbers didn't lie, and lies were how half the claims in the territory got sold. Mercy had grown up in mining towns the way other children grow up on farms, moving with the seasons of ore, learning the sound of a stamp mill the way other girls learned hymns. Her mother had died when Mercy was 9. Thrown from a wagon on a grade too steep for the weather, and after that, it had been just the 2 of them, father and daughter, trailing from camp to camp with a tin trunk of scales and ledgers, and a small collection of books that Elias insisted she read aloud to him by lamplight, because a mind gone soft, he always said, was worse than a body gone soft. She learned geology from him the way other children learned their letters. She learned, too, the particular grief of watching men she liked get cheated by men she didn't, and she learned that her father would rather go hungry than put his name to a false number. The last camp they'd lived in together was called Ironwood Gulch, high in a fold of red rock country, where a vein of silver had drawn nearly 400 souls in the space of 2 years, and then, as such veins do, seemed to give out all at once. The mine's owner at the time was a hard, glittering man named Josiah Vane, who built himself a fine house on the ridge above the diggings, while the miners below him took their pay in company scrip and company debt. When the vein played out, Josiah's words, delivered to a town meeting with a theatrical sorrow that fooled no one who looked closely, he shuttered the mine, called in the miners' debts, and rode away wealthy, while 300 families scattered to the wind with nothing. Elias Calloway had been the assayer on that final survey. He had signed his name to a report that said, officially, that the vein was exhausted. He had told Mercy, years later, in the small hours of a night when his lungs would not let him sleep, that it was the only lie he had ever put his name to, and that it had cost him more than all his honest years combined. We'll tell you exactly what that lie was hiding, and why he carried it in silence for the rest of his life. But first, you should know what it cost him to keep it. The town emptied within a season. buildings were abandoned mid-meal, mid-mending, mid-life, the way ghost towns always are, as if the people simply evaporated and left their kettles on the stove. Elias took what little he'd saved and moved on, and he and Mercy drifted through 4 more camps over the next 15 years, never quite as prosperous, never quite trusted the way he once had been, because a man who works for Josiah Vane carries that name on him like a brand, fair or not. Elias grew quieter with each passing year. He coughed more. He read his surveys by candlelight long after Mercy had gone to bed, and more than once she woke to find him at the table with a small tin box he never let her open, running his thumb along its clasp like a man saying a rosary. Mercy remembered those years less as a sequence of towns, and more as a sequence of smells. The sharp, mineral tang of fresh broken rock in her father's coat pockets, the tallow and wood smoke smell of every rented room they'd ever slept in, the particular, bitter smell of a camp going bad, the smell of men who had stopped believing they'd be paid, which she learned to recognize the way other children learn to recognize rain coming. She remembered, too, the sound of her father's scale, a small brass thing, balanced so finely that a single grain of sand could tip it, and the reverence with which he cleaned it each night with a soft cloth, the way another man might have cleaned a rifle or a rosary. "The scale doesn't care who's rich and who's poor, Mercy," he told her once, when she was perhaps 12, and had asked why he wouldn't just round a number up to please an angry mine owner. "The day I let it care is the day I've got nothing left worth having." She had believed him with her whole heart. It was part of why the silence that fell over him after Ironwood Gulch frightened her so badly, not because he changed, exactly, but because some current beneath his surface, some part of him that had always run clean and sure, seemed to have gone dark and still. There had been a woman, once, in the 3rd camp after Ironwood Gulch, a schoolteacher named Ruth, who might, in some other version of their lives, have become Mercy's stepmother. Elias courted her with the same careful, unhurried honesty he brought to everything, and for the better part of a year, Mercy allowed herself to hope for an ordinary kind of happiness. But Ruth asked him, one evening, why he never spoke of Ironwood Gulch, and something closed in her father's face that Mercy had never seen before, and would see many times again in the years that followed. He never told Ruth the truth. He let her go instead, gently, the way he let go of most things after that. Work he was better suited for, friendships that asked too many questions, any comfort that required him to explain himself. Mercy had resented Ruth's leaving for a long time, before she came to understand that her father hadn't been protecting himself. He'd been protecting a secret he judged too dangerous to share with anyone he loved, for fear of what it might cost them. By the time his lungs began to fail him in earnest, Elias Calloway had become a man who kept almost everything folded close and small, except, Mercy noticed only in hindsight, that one battered tin box, which traveled with them through every move, every rented room, every hard season, never opened in her presence, never once left behind. She used to tease him about it, lightly, the way a daughter can tease a father she trusts completely. "What's in the box, Papa? Your fortune?" And he would smile at her, a real smile, one of the few unguarded ones left to him by then, and say, something like that, "Someday it'll matter. Not yet." She had assumed, when she assumed anything at all, that it held old love letters, or her mother's things, or nothing more remarkable than a lifetime's accumulation of a private man's private papers. She never once imagined it held the truth about a mine, a fraud, and 300 ruined families, because her father had never let her imagine that he, of all people, might have something to be ashamed of. He died in the spring, in a rented room above a dry goods store, with Mercy holding his hand, and Scout, then barely 2 years old, a rescue pup from a litter born under that same store's porch, pressed so close against the bed that the old man's last breath stirred the fur on the dog's head. Elias's final words were not sentimental. He gripped his daughter's wrist with more strength than she thought his ruined lungs could summon, and said, "Ironwood Gulch is yours now. Don't let the county sell it. Whatever they offer you instead, don't take it. Promise me, Mercy." She promised, the way you promise a dying man anything, without understanding what she was promising. It was only after the funeral, going through his effects, that she found the deed, forgotten, overlooked, filed among his papers like any other document, naming him, and now her, as the sole legal claimant to 110 acres, including the entirety of the town of Ironwood Gulch, its buildings, and all mineral rights beneath it. The county, it turned out, had been trying for 2 years to clear the title through a tax forfeiture sale, since no one had paid so much as $1 of levy on a ghost town in over a decade. A land agent, a smooth, unhurried man named Silas Vane, who bore his father Josiah's name, and Mercy would soon learn, a great deal more of his father's nature besides, had already made an offer to the county to buy the whole parcel outright, cheap, the moment the forfeiture went through. He offered Mercy $40 to simply sign her claim over to him directly, and spare everyone the paperwork. $40 was more money than Mercy had held in one place in 3 years. She had a dying father's promise ringing in her ears, and a dog who would not stop growling, low and steady, every single time Silas Vane's name was spoken in her presence. She said no. She sold nearly everything she owned that wasn't nailed down, borrowed against what little credit her father's old name could still buy her in a town 2 counties over, and rode 2 days into the Red Rock Hills with Scout trotting the whole way at her stirrup, to pay the back taxes herself, in cash, on a town that every soul in Prescott Hollow assured her was worth less than the paper the deed was printed on. They rode into Ironwood Gulch on the 3rd afternoon, and the town that greeted them was exactly the specter its name implied, a single rutted street, lined with buildings gone gray and silver with age, doors hanging open on leather hinges long since dried to dust, a stamp mill standing silent and rust-throated on the hillside like the ribcage of some enormous animal. The wind moved through empty windows and made a sound like breathing. Tumbleweed had drifted waist-deep against the old assay office, her father's old office, she realized with a catch in her chest, and a single church steeple, weathered nearly black, still leaned faithfully toward the sky at the far end of the street. It should have felt like a graveyard. Instead, the moment Scout's paws touched the dry earth of that street, the dog went taut as a bowstring, nose working, ears forward, every muscle in his compact body pointed like an arrow toward the little white chapel at the end of the road. Mercy had seen Scout excited before. Rabbits, prairie dogs, the occasional rattlesnake that earned him a sharp word and a wide berth. She had never seen him like this. He whined, high and urgent, a sound she'd only ever heard from him once before, in the room above the dry goods store, in the hour before her father died. We promise you, the story only gets stranger from here, because what Scout had already sensed, Mercy wouldn't understand for 3 more days, and when she finally did, it would change everything she thought she knew about her father's silence. For the first 2 days, Mercy did what any sensible new landholder would do. She inventoried what she'd bought. The town was, by any practical measure, worthless in the way the county clerk had implied. 41 structures in varying states of collapse, no running water beyond the old town well, no residents, no commerce, no prospects. She walked the length of the street with a ledger she'd inherited from her father, out of habit as much as purpose, cataloging what stood and what had fallen. The mercantile, its shelves still lined with tins gone black with rust. The boarding house, its stairs eaten through by termites. The old assay office, where she found, with a small private ache, a brass scale identical to the one her father had carried in his coat all his life, still sitting on its shelf, as though he might walk back in and reach for it. Scout walked beside her through all of it, but not beside her exactly. He kept drifting off toward the chapel at the far end of the street, circling back to nudge her hand, then drifting off again, whining low in his throat, as though he were trying, in the only language available to him, to drag her somewhere by the sheer force of his attention. He tried it first at the old well, pawing at the loose stones around its rim, until Mercy pulled him back for fear he'd fall in, and she'd thought, that first afternoon, that perhaps he only smelled a rabbit's den, or the bones of some long-dead animal, the ordinary business of a working dog's nose. But by the second evening, when she sat down to a cold supper on the boarding-house steps, Scout refused his own meal entirely, a thing he had never once done in his life, not even the week he'd had a fever that frightened her half to death, and simply sat facing the chapel, ears up, tail still, until the light went and the first stars came out. There was something almost mournful in the set of his shoulders, something that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the way he'd lain across her father's chest in those last hours above the dry goods store, as if he understood grief and secrets the way other dogs understood weather. On the second evening, as the light went long and gold across the red rock, Mercy finally followed him. The chapel door had swollen shut with a decade of weather, and she had to put her shoulder into it before it gave with a groan that sent a startled dust of old plaster sifting down from the rafters. Inside, the pews stood in neat ghostly rows, furred with dust, a small pump organ still standing at the front beneath a window whose colored glass had somehow survived intact, throwing a faded rectangle of red and blue light across the floorboards. Scout did not hesitate. He went straight to a spot beneath the third pew from the front, on the left side, and began to dig at the floor with a single-minded intensity that made splinters fly, whining the whole while. Not a distressed sound, Mercy realized, but something closer to grief, or to recognition, the sound a creature makes when it has found the last trace of something it loved. The chapel smelled of cold stone and old candle wax, and faintly, of the sage that grew wild through the broken window frames, and beneath it all, something mineral and dry, that Mercy's whole life had trained her to notice. The smell of rock that had been broken open and left in the sun. Dust hung suspended in the last shaft of colored light, turning slowly, and somewhere above them, a bird had built a nest in the bell tower, and shifted at the sound of Scout's digging, sending down a soft rain of straw. Mercy knelt beside him, and ran her hand over the boards. They were newer than the others, not by much, a few years perhaps, but enough that a careful eye could see the seam where old wood had been cut away, and fresh planks fitted in, the nailheads not quite weathered to match their neighbors. Her father had been an assayer, not a carpenter, but he had spent 30 years around men who built things to hide things, and he had learned. Mercy fetched a pry bar from her saddlebag, with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and by the last of the daylight, with Scout pressed so close against her side that she could feel him shaking with the effort of holding still, she lifted the boards away and looked down into a shallow cellar space, no bigger than a bread box, dug into the hard red clay beneath the chapel floor. Inside sat a tin document box, its clasp gone orange with rust, identical in every particular to the one she remembered from her childhood, the one her father used to run his thumb along in the candlelit hours when he thought she was asleep. It took her the better part of an hour, with a chisel and no small amount of prayer, to force the rusted clasp. When it finally gave, what she found inside was not gold, though gold, in the form of 3 small heavy pouches of raw ore samples, each one labeled in her father's careful, cramped hand, was indeed part of it. What mattered more was the paper. A full survey report, dated 3 weeks before the official one Mercy Calloway had signed for Josiah Vane, showing, in numbers as careful and honest as anything her father had ever written, that the ironwood vein had not played out at all. It had, if anything, been getting richer, running deeper and wider than the original claim boundaries, angling beneath ground that belonged not to the mine but to the town itself, to land held in common by the miners' families under an old cooperative charter that Josiah Vane had spent a great deal of money and effort to make everyone forget existed. There was a second document beneath it, written in her father's hand, and addressed, it seemed, to no one in particular, or perhaps to whoever might one day find it. In it, Elias Calloway confessed what he had done, and why. Josiah Vane had come to him 3 weeks before the mine closed, and told him, plainly, that if the true survey ever saw daylight, the miners' cooperative charter would entitle every family in Ironwood Gulch to a share of a fortune Vane intended to keep entirely for himself, and that Elias's daughter, then a girl of 16 with no mother and no protector but her father, would find herself very unwelcome in every camp from here to the territorial line if her father didn't sign the false report instead. Elias had signed it. He had spent the rest of his life ashamed of it, and the rest of his life quietly gathering what proof he could, waiting, hoping, for a day when it might safely come to light, a day he did not live to see. Mercy sat on the floor of that dusty chapel until the stars came out, her father's confession in her lap, Scout's head heavy and warm across her knees, and understood for the first time in her life exactly what her father's silence had cost him, and exactly what he had left her instead of an apology. But you should know, Silas Vane did not ride 2 days to Prescott Hollow and back just to lose a worthless ghost town without a fight, and what he did next would test every bit of the courage Mercy had left. Word travels strangely in the high country, faster than any rider, carried on the backs of rumor and speculation, and it was not more than a week before Silas Vane appeared at the edge of Ironwood Gulch on a horse too fine for the country, flanked by 2 men whose purpose was plainly not conversation. Mercy had expected him eventually. What she had not expected was how much he looked like his father in the photographs her own father had once, bitterly, kept. The same unhurried smile, the same eyes that priced a person the way other men priced cattle. He was, at first, almost courteous. He'd heard, he said, that she'd taken quite an interest in the old chapel. He'd heard she'd been asking the county clerk questions about old mining cooperative charters. He wondered, with the studied likeness of a man who already knew the answer, whether she'd found anything of interest up here in all this dust. Mercy told him, evenly, that she'd found exactly what her father had left her, and that it belonged to the town, not to him. Something in Silas Vane's face went very still at that, the courtesy sliding off it like water off oiled canvas, and Scout, who had been sitting quietly at her side through the whole exchange, rose to his feet with his hackles up and a low continuous growl building in his chest, planting himself squarely between Mercy and the 3 mounted men without so much as a command to do so. Vane didn't threaten her outright. Men like him rarely needed to. He simply informed her, with the pleasant finality of a debt collector, that the county's forfeiture paperwork had a clerical irregularity he intended to have corrected within the week, that her tax payment would very likely be found invalid on a technicality, and that when it was, the parcel would revert to auction, where he intended to be the only bidder. He tipped his hat, wheeled his fine horse, and left her standing in the street with nothing but the dust of his going, and a growing, cold certainty that he meant to simply steal from her, by paper and procedure, what he could not take by force. Vane did not wait a week to make good on his implied threat. 3 nights later, Mercy woke to Scout's frantic barking, and the sharp, unmistakable smell of coal oil on the wind. 2 of Vane's men had crept as far as the chapel steps with a lantern and a can of fuel, meaning, she understood at once with a cold horror, to burn away the one piece of ground that could undo their employer entirely. But Scout had heard them crossing the street long before they reached the door, and by the time Mercy came running in her nightclothes with her father's old shotgun shaking in her hands, the dog had already driven the men back into the dark, with a fury she had never seen in him before, all teeth and noise, and copper-colored menace, standing his ground between the intruders and the chapel door, until they broke and ran for their horses. He was not touched, she made certain of that with trembling hands, running her palms over every inch of him by lantern light, but he did not sleep again that night, or the next, choosing instead to lie across the chapel threshold itself, as if he had appointed himself its permanent guard, and Mercy, moved nearly to tears by the sight of him, brought her own bedroll out to the chapel steps, and did not leave him there alone again. The attempted burning did more to steel Mercy's resolve than any amount of careful reasoning could have. She rode to the county sheriff the following morning, and swore out a formal complaint. And though the sheriff, a tired, practical man named Coleridge, who had no love for Silas Vane, but even less appetite for a fight with him, could promise little beyond a report filed and a patrol added, the incident itself became, in time, a piece of evidence no court could easily dismiss. Proof, alongside the paper trail, that Vane's interest in a worthless ghost town ran a great deal deeper than idle real estate speculation. She spent that night by lamplight, the way her father used to, going through every document in that tin box a second and third time, and a fourth, cross-referencing the old cooperative charter's language against the county's own recording books, which, thank whatever careful God watches over the daughters of careful men, Elias Calloway had also, in his methodical way, thought to copy out by hand decades before, and tuck into the bottom of that same tin box, as if he had known that someday paper would be the only weapon his daughter would have. What she found, in the gray hour before dawn, was this: the Miners' Cooperative Charter, properly recorded in the territorial capital in 1868, and never once formally dissolved, granted the town's mineral rights to the collective heirs of its founding families, rights that could not be severed by any county tax sale, because the land had never truly belonged to Josiah Vane's mining company at all. It had only ever been leased to it. The lease had lapsed the very year the mine closed. Silas Vane didn't merely risk losing a bidding war for worthless real estate, he risked exposure as the heir to a fraud that had cheated 300 families out of a fortune, and he risked it becoming public exactly how his father had coerced a grieving, frightened assayer into signing his name to a lie. Mercy rode to the territorial land office herself, 2 days each way, Scout never more than a stride from her stirrup the entire distance, sleeping across her feet each night like a living, breathing lock on her door. She filed her father's true survey, and his written confession, as part of the public record, invoking the cooperative charter, before the clerical irregularity Vane had promised could ever be manufactured. She sent letters, copied out longhand by her own tired wrist, 23 of them, to every family name she could trace from the old Ironwood Gulch rolls, families scattered now across 4 territories, informing each one of a legal claim on a fortune they had believed lost for 15 years. The county hearing, when it came, was not the quiet formality Silas Vane had clearly expected. He arrived with lawyers. He left, an hour later, with neither the parcel nor his father's reputation intact, and with a formal notice of investigation into fraudulent recording practices trailing him out the door like a shadow he could not outrun. Descendants of the old Ironwood families began arriving within the month, some skeptical, some weeping, all of them astonished to learn that the ground their grandparents had been driven off of still, by law and by right, belonged in part to them. Together, with Mercy as the reluctant but resolute administrator of a charter 15 years dormant, they reopened a portion of the vein under new and honest terms, with shares distributed exactly as her father's true numbers had always said they should be. Ironwood Gulch did not become a boomtown again, not quite, not the way it had been in its brief, feverish youth. It became something steadier, and in its own way, something better. The reopened vein was worked under a new charter, one Mercy drafted herself with the help of a sympathetic territorial lawyer, that split every dollar of profit among the descended families according to the original cooperative's honest terms, including, at the insistence of nearly every family who signed it, a share set aside permanently for Mercy Calloway, whose father's stubborn conscience, and whose own stubborn courage, had returned to them a fortune they had long since stopped believing in. She refused it twice, before finally accepting, on the condition that half of her portion go toward a fund for widows and orphans of the old camp, a gesture that would have made her father, she thought, prouder than any essay report ever could. A schoolhouse went up where the old assay office had stood, built in part from lumber salvaged from the very buildings Mercy had once catalogued as ruins, and the first child to write her name on its chalkboard was the granddaughter of a miner who had left Ironwood Gulch in disgrace 15 years before, with nothing but a mule and a grudge. The mercantile reopened under new ownership within the year, its shelves stocked with goods instead of rust. The old boarding house, condemned as unsalvageable by Mercy's own first ledger, was torn down entirely and replaced with something sturdier, and not one soul in the rebuilt town ever again called Ironwood Gulch a fool's inheritance. The chapel was repaired first of all, before the schoolhouse, before the mercantile, before even Mercy's own small house at the edge of town, because it seemed to her, and to everyone who heard the story of how it had nearly burned, that it deserved to come first. Its floor was mended properly this time, the old boards replaced, not to hide a secret, but simply because the wood beneath them had earned its rest, and its little colored window was cleaned so thoroughly that the light through it fell clean and bright across pews that filled, once a week, with families who had a reason now to stay. On the day of its rededication, the whole town gathered on the chapel steps, and Scout, gray now around the muzzle, slower in the mornings than he had once been, but still first through any door that mattered, was given a place of honor at the front, a small brass plate fixed to the church's cornerstone bearing his name alongside Elias Calloway's, because more than one Ironwood family insisted a dog who had guarded the truth with his own body deserved to be remembered in the same breath as the man who had buried it. Silas Vane, for his part, lost a great deal more than a parcel of land. The formal investigation into his father's old fraud, once opened, proved impossible to close quietly, and within 2 years, his name carried the same poor currency in mining circles that Josiah Vane's had once, briefly, threatened to bring down on Elias Calloway. He left the territory rather than face it, and no one in Ironwood Gulch ever heard from him again, though for a long while afterward, mothers in the new schoolhouse would tell the story of the land agent who tried to steal a ghost town and lost everything to a girl and her dog, until it took on the soft, worn shape of a fable, repeated so often that the children could no longer say which parts were fact and which had simply grown truer with the telling. Mercy kept her father's tin box on a shelf in the home she built at the edge of town, its rusted clasp mended but deliberately left unpolished, a reminder of exactly what it had cost to open. Some evenings, when the light went long and gold the way it had that very first evening, she would walk down to the chapel and sit on its steps, with Scout's graying head heavy across her knee, and think that her father, quiet, careful, ashamed man that he was, had in the end found a way to tell the truth after all. He had simply needed a dog patient enough, and a daughter stubborn enough, to dig it up. We've told you now what was buried beneath Ironwood Gulch, and what it cost, and what it finally set right, but we're curious what you would have done in Mercy's place. If you found a hidden piece of history that could change everything for the people who came after, would you keep it for yourself, or would you share it? Tell us below. Until next time, stay close.